It was a quiet night in London. The street was silent, with only a few lights on in the surrounding houses. The cold weather made the atmosphere even calmer, and the light breeze scattered dry leaves across the sidewalk. Amid this tranquility, a black car with tinted windows discreetly parked in front of one of the houses. Two men stepped out of the vehicle and observed the residence for a few moments. It was a nice house, but not ostentatious. No flashy signs of wealth, just an ordinary home in a discreet neighborhood. Exactly the kind of target they liked. Houses belonging to wealthy people, but without excessive security systems. "Are you sure this is the place?" asked one of the thieves, a tall, thin man wearing a black hoodie and a mask covering half his face. "Absolutely," replied the other, shorter and stockier, wearing a dark jacket and leather gloves. "I got the information from a guy who knows this area well. The owner of this house is rich, but low-key. He must have jewelry, expensive watches, cash, things like that." The plan was already in place. They had studied the location for a few days and knew that the owner was usually not home at night. There were no visible signs of cameras, and as far as they had noticed, the neighborhood was the type where people avoided getting involved in trouble. After a few more minutes of observation, one of the thieves approached the side door of the house and began working on the lock with a master key. He was experienced, and in less than a minute, a soft click indicated that the door was unlocked. They entered cautiously, closing the door behind them. The interior of the house was dark, but a quick scan with their flashlights revealed a tidy and simple environment. Nothing extravagant or overly decorated. "This doesn't look like a rich person's house," murmured the shorter thief. "That's how they fool people," the other replied. "Truly rich people don't fill their homes with gold but keep everything in strategic places." Quickly, they began searching the house. Within the first few minutes, they found some expensive watches, electronics, designer clothes, and even a shiny metal that seemed to be related to football. "Could this be from a football player?" asked the tall thief, examining the metal. "Maybe, but who cares? Let's grab what we can and get out of here," said the other, uninterested. As they filled a backpack with valuable items, they passed by the living room and noticed a shelf full of trophies and medals. Some of them had engravings with the name N'Golo Kanté. "That name sounds familiar," murmured the tall thief. "He must be some businessman or something," the other replied dismissively. "Come on, let's hurry before someone notices." They continued gathering items and carrying them to the car parked across the street. They were almost done when they suddenly heard a noise at the front entrance. Someone was unlocking the main door. Both men froze for a moment, feeling their hearts race. This wasn't part of the plan. The owner of the house wasn't supposed to be home at this hour. The door opened gently, and a figure stepped inside. It was a man of average height, dressed in simple clothes, carrying a grocery bag in one hand. His face seemed familiar, but in the dark, the thieves couldn't immediately recognize him. He turned on the hallway light and took a step forward, looking around. His eyes scanned the suitcases and objects stacked near the exit. He frowned, confused. The thieves, still hiding, finally got a clear look at his face. That's when they realized who he was. The owner of the house, the man they had just robbed, was none other than N'Golo Kanté. For a moment, the thieves were paralyzed. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. N'Golo Kanté, one of the most beloved and respected football players in the world, was standing there at the entrance of his own home, looking at the objects they had taken. The taller thief, still holding an expensive watch, swallowed hard. He looked at his partner, who seemed just as stunned. They were used to breaking into the homes of businessmen, politicians, and arrogant rich people. But now they found themselves face to face with a living legend of football, a player known not just for his talent, but for his humility and generosity. Kanté finally noticed the two men near the back door. His eyes widened slightly, but to the thieves' surprise, he didn't scream, didn't run, didn't reach for his phone to call the police. Instead, he just looked at them with a confused expression, almost innocent, as if trying to understand what was happening. What are you doing?" Kanté asked, his voice calm, without aggression. The thieves exchanged glances. Neither of them knew what to say. They were armed with crowbars and knives, but in front of this man, any violent intention suddenly felt absurd. He didn't look angry, just sad and disappointed. The shorter thief, still holding a backpack full of Kanté's belongings, took a deep breath and shook his head. "Man, we didn't know this was your house," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "If we had known," the taller one added, looking at the expensive watch in his hand before carefully placing it back on the table. Kanté remained silent for a few moments, watching as the two men began putting everything back. It was a surreal scene. Two thieves who had meticulously planned this robbery were now undoing it all as if trying to erase their mistake. They returned the watches to the drawer, placed the medals back on the shelf, and even folded some of the clothes they had taken from the wardrobe. The shorter thief picked up a pack of food from the counter and put it back in place, as if simply touching Kanté's belongings had been an unacceptable act of disrespect. The player watched them in silence, not saying a word, just following their every move. He saw the two men finish tidying up the house and head toward the door, looking embarrassed. Before they left, the taller thief hesitated and turned to Kanté. "I'm really sorry about this, man," he said, scratching the back of his head. "We shouldn't have been here." The other thief nodded and added, "You're a good person. We know that. This wasn't supposed to happen." Kanté looked at them for a moment and, surprising them even more, asked, "Are you hungry?" The thieves were speechless. They were ready to run away into the cold London night, to disappear without a trace, but Kanté, the man they had just tried to rob, was standing there, offering them food as if they were old acquaintances. There was a long silence before the shorter thief let out a small, awkward laugh and shook his head. "We've already caused enough trouble, man, but thanks. Seriously." The taller one opened the door and gave Kanté one last look. "You're different. We'll never do something like this again." And without another word, they stepped out through the back door, disappearing into the darkness and getting into the car that was waiting for them. Kanté stood still in the living room for a while, looking around. His house was exactly as he had left it, as if nothing had happened. But he knew that this night would stay with him forever. What could have been a night of terror had turned into a moment of reflection, not just for the thieves, but for Kanté as well. Kanté stood still for a few moments after the thieves had left. The house was silent once again, as if nothing had happened. But deep inside, he knew that this night would never leave his memory. He slowly walked around the living room, observing each object the thieves had put back in its place. It was strange to think that just minutes ago, all of this was about to be taken away. But the most surprising thing wasn't the fact that they had returned everything, it was why they had done it. Respect. Respect for his story, for who he was, for what he represented. It wasn't fear. It wasn't just guilt. It was something deeper. Kanté sighed and walked into the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water and sat down at the table, trying to process everything that had happened. He considered calling the police, but quickly dismissed the idea. There was no need. They hadn't taken anything. They hadn't hurt him. And most importantly, they had left that house as different people from the ones who had entered. Deep down, Kanté knew that those two would never do something like this again. Not because they had been caught, not because they were scared, but because they had understood something much bigger. He sipped his water slowly, still lost in thought. The next day, he didn't tell anyone about what had happened. He went about his routine as usual, training, talking to his teammates, keeping the same quiet, humble smile he always had. But throughout the day, his mind kept drifting back to those two men and the way things had unfolded. A few weeks later, one afternoon, after training, Kanté stopped by a small neighborhood market to buy some bread and fruit. He preferred shopping at simple places, away from big supermarkets and crowds of people who might recognize him. As he picked some apples, he noticed two familiar figures on the other side of the store. Two men he never thought he would see again. The thieves. They were dressed simply, blending in with the rest of the customers. The taller one was holding a shopping basket, while the shorter one carried some packs of food. They looked different from that night, not just in their clothing, but in their posture, in their eyes. For a moment, Kanté wondered if they would run upon seeing him, but to his surprise, the taller thief noticed him first and froze for a second before giving a small, hesitant smile. He nudged his partner, who also looked at Kanté and immediately seemed embarrassed. Kanté simply smiled back, a sincere and calm smile. Then, without saying a word, he gave them a small nod, as if to say, "It's all good." The two men exhaled deeply, as if that simple gesture had lifted a weight off their shoulders. They didn't approach him, didn't try to start a conversation. They just respected the moment. Kanté finished picking his groceries and went to the cashier. When he left the store, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. That night, months ago, had already changed everything. For them, and, in a way, for him too.